live. Here we are, episode 2, the Reed's Renegade Radio Podcast, emanating from Reed's house. We're recording this May 16th, 2021. Our producer, Matt Gilbride, he is back. We've got the audio set up in Reed's. Matthew, welcome back to the podcast.
A new audio setup. It's different.
It's set up for a better group dynamic, and who better to introduce our guest? Upper Six Matheson's Andrei Lomonosov. Welcome to the podcast, Andrei.
Yeah, hello. I'm really pleased to be here. It's my first time.
It's great to have you. Feedback from our first episode on Star Wars, A New Hope, seems to be super popular with the fourth form. We got some really good feedback from everybody. Everyone seems to like the setup. Just a little bit. The podcast in general is a platform for Reed's pupils, Glenolman pupils to come on and talk about topics that they're interested in. So we're not specializing in just one thing, and it's not just we're looking at doing current events, anniversaries, pop culture, the things that the pupils are interested in. So it's very much a pupil-led podcast. And looking at the calendar, we actually missed it by a week, but last Sunday was the 76th anniversary, the end of the Second World War in Europe. So today, with our resident historians, Andrei and Matthew, we're going to look back at the impact the Second World War had on us and what it means today. So, boys, I pose to you, why is the Second World War the perfect era for studying history? Go ahead, Matthew.
Oh, to be basic about it, it's interesting because it is sort of modern warfare, but it's also it's in a time where war is easy to get immersed in. It's so full on, but it's got all these amazing leaders like Churchill and like public speakers and like Roosevelt and Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. I say great. They were very larger than life. They weren't all. None of them were perfect, and a lot of them were the opposite. But it's just, and we've got so many documents from it. Everything has been recorded because everything that we knew at that point that how significant it would be, because the nuclear bomb meant that there would never be a war like that again, and hopefully there won't be. Andrei, why do you think?
Well, in my opinion, the Second World War is definitely a very interesting era due to the fact that, again, it happened quite recently. And the thing can be applied that there are a lot of strategic, interesting points from view from the different leaders and the way how the war was happening as well. It's very interesting. Just how it completely turned from one side to the other, and also I'm really interested in the military equipment, and because it was an era of very rapid development of the weapons, and also I think it's very interesting era because a lot of interesting leaders emerged with interesting ideas from all the countries, from both sides, and just in general, I agree with Matthew that it was as well documented, and quite a lot of information is out there to study and to learn.
I agree about, especially the point you made about being a modern war. I mean, I'm the old guy in the group here, and I've been studying the Second World War for 30 years now. And Stalin, Churchill, Hitler, Mussolini, Hirohito, Franklin Roosevelt. These are the big players in this. But there's thousands of characters that sort of have a role to play in this war, and it's the stories. Mussolini's break out of prison, by the German army. Stalin winding up Churchill. Secret back deal negotiations between the Soviets, Nazis, Americans as the war progresses. it's World War II is these ultimate desperation moments mixed in with James Bond theme type espionage that if it happened in a movie you wouldn't believe it. The things that you learn about in the 6 or so years of the Second World War, it just seems like it's written in a Hollywood script. Now, the great thing about the three of us together is what a different perspective. I already mentioned I'm the old guy, you guys are the young guys, but where else you get? I grew up in the United States, so I was taught a certain perspective about this war from an American perspective. Andrei, you're Russian. Matthew, you get the British perspective. We all have definitely different ideas about how, especially when we were in our younger days, about how it was all sort of brought up. Andrei, growing up in Russia, how was the Second World War perceived from your family to in school?
Well, of course, from the young age we had a really strong impact because the history of the World War II is taught since the first grade of Russian school, and we also have every year large parades that commemorate the Victory Day on the 9th of May. And basically, every person from Russia is just immersed and knows a lot of facts and stories about the World War II because every family was in one or other way affected by this really horrible and terrific event. And we also get taught about the importance of not repeating this horrible thing and just to continue living on peacefully.
Yeah, and from the British perspective as well, it's always taught us something horrible. I mean, I was speaking to my uncle earlier today, and he's saying that when he was at boarding school, that the most significant thing that impacted them was the rationing. Because they never had butter in school. That was just something that didn't have, no sugar. And it meant everyone was so much healthier. But it's also a time of deprivation for the population. To compare it to like today in the pandemic age, it's sort of, obviously this is much more civilized, we'd say, but there's a lot of stuff you can do that you would have thought you should be able to do just because of the national interest.
It's been, growing up in the US, it was education, especially at a young age, it was such an American perspective. And, I didn't even know what a victory in Europe was a big deal because for the Americans, of course, they had to shift their focus to the Japanese theater and carry on for, 3 months still to go for that war. So, it's interesting that, the British celebrations that were happening around Europe, not British celebrations, European celebrations that were happening around Europe after the victory in Europe for the eastern part of the world, in the Pacific, it was war continuing, still moving on. But it wasn't until, I moved to Europe when I finally got to, talk to pupils as well as friends and their family and find out about, all the things that happened, the rationing, obviously the bombings in London and stuff where I lived for 5 years and to experience those, through like word of mouth from people who actually lived through it has been quite eye-opening really when you only get the perspective. You can only imagine, if someone in China or Japan and what their perspective would be. So, interestingly enough, we, coming from 3 different countries, 3 different parts of the world, the 3 of us, we all have different family histories. Matthew, you mentioned your uncle. Do you have an interesting story to share about the war?
Well, so he was at St Joseph's College in Dumfries, which was at that time a boys' boarding school. But on VE Day, he told me that when it was announced, they were told they weren't to celebrate victory, they were to celebrate peace, because celebrating victory would be crude. And but he did tell me that stuff like street parties in Glasgow took place, and drinking in the streets and singing and all that stuff took place. But there was no television, so everything was announced over the wireless. And it meant that it wasn't greatly significant to them at the time. Not until later did he actually realise how important it was, because as a boy, I think 14, he would have been that sort of age where it didn't affect him. I'm not sure about 14 actually. But he was a boy in senior school, but it wasn't impactful at that time. It just. But VJ Day, he told me that they went out with a naval officer who brought them bananas and had a picnic. And that was VJ Day. That was the first time they'd seen bananas.
That's pretty cool. Andrei, anything from your family's perspective?
Well, unfortunately, I have really little information due to the fact that I couldn't talk to my great-grandfathers who participated in the war because they died. But remembering from the tales of my parents that they can remember, my great-grandfather from mother's side was Ukrainian. He fought near Odessa, and he also fought during the war near Kiev. He went to the Berlin, and and he essentially didn't really like to talk about war because it was a really terrible time, and he didn't even want to remember that. While my great-grandfather on my paternal side fought with Japan against Kwantung Army, and at the end of the war he was assigned to be in a security guard for the imprisoned Japanese soldiers, and these soldiers actually were used to build new houses and new places for living in far east of Russia, in the city of Khabarovsk and Vladivostok. And he essentially was a part of the garden who looked after them. So yeah, that's essentially the story.
I have similar to Matthew. My grandfather was too young to serve, so started training as a paratrooper after the war, but didn't end up having any combat. But really important story to my wife's family was her father. So my father-in-law's uncle, so Uncle Tom, he was part of the Sherbrooke Fusiliers. So he trained in Quebec in Canada, flew to Britain and he was part of the D-Day launch. So he actually was successful in landing on Juno Beach. So they marched south the following day, so D-Day +1, into Alfie through wheat fields. There they were spotted by the 12th SS Panzer Division, led by Colonel Kurt Meyer, who had joined the Nazi Party in 1930 at the age of 19. So as a Panzer Division, that group was nicknamed the Panzermeier, and they were pretty fanatical about the lack of taking prisoners and their heavy fighting. So Canadian members of the Fusiliers, including Mrs. Meyer's Uncle Tom, were captured. 8 were told to remove their helmets. They were shot in the head. 6 others were marched into a kitchen and shot. Their chaplain was stabbed and killed. So Uncle Tom and his unit were herded to the Abbaye d'Ardenne outside of Alfie. This is just 10 miles south of Juno Beach where they landed. Colonel Meyer was quoted as saying, "Why do you bring prisoners to the rear? They only eat up our rations. In the future, no more prisons are to be taken." Give you a perspective of how the SS were fighting following the D-Day launch. Prisoners surrendered their paybooks. One at a time, they were taken from a basement in the Abbey to be questioned about Allied locations. No one talked, and each man, including Tom, was shot. After the war, a French farmer found the bodies, and it serves today as a memorial site. My son is named Tom, after his relative who survived the D-Day landing only to be executed the following day. So, Mrs. Myers has been to the Abbey. She saw it. It's one of those, unbelievable, acts of bravery because, under the threat of violence, they were asked to disclose Allied locations. And, to a man, none of them did. They knew what was going to happen. They knew the reputation of the Panzer division, and they all fought very bravely. So it's these kind of stories that we all have that everyone, whether they were a small child or an adult serving it, is quite, there's a lot of heroism there in discussing how it happens. A little bit grander scale, because I got a major in history. I said, but wait, sir, you're a geography teacher. It's like, yes, but history is also one of my passions. You both study history. So what is it about the 21st century and this war? Because as we'll talk about, was the war 6 years or was the war 70 years? And, did it continue all the way through into the Cold War? But why is it, Matthew, that this helped get you so passionate about studying history?
I mean, just from having the toy versions of the grenades at home to the helmets and the model soldiers, it's just immersing yourself in it and looking at all the operations. Some of the less famous ones in North Africa, like Wavell, Montgomery, and also President Eisenhower, who led the D-Day, and how they had the inflatable units from a disgraced US military general. I've actually forgotten his name. But they knew he was disgraced because he'd hit a private. In the US, you're not allowed to do that.
You're talking about Patton.
It's a Patton.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Patton
famously slapped two privates.
He slapped two privates, right? And immediately
he's coming up later.
Yeah. So he slaps two privates, and instead of properly demoting him and firing him, well, as would be normal procedure, they put him in charge of, as a figurehead, they put him in charge of the inflatable division, because they knew that the Nazis would take it more seriously because Patton was there. Patton was such a huge figure in the US military, and they wouldn't think anything about slapping two privates. It's just the whole different culture and how they used it against them. That was one of the things I read about when I was doing my coursework on Churchill as a wartime leader, which is obviously World War II. And that was one of the things that I read about, and that was his idea, Churchill's, to do that. And that's one of the things that got me even more immersed. It's like these things keep coming up. There's new stuff all the time. And it's one of my units, and it's supposed to be next year. Is going to be on this subject because I'm doing a history degree at Dundee next year, history and economics. And one of the main things in history is going to be World War II.
Oh, I want to go. Andrei, is it the characters, is it the stories, is it the events? You talked about the equipment. What's gotten you so interested in this?
Well, basically, my father was very enthusiastic about World War II and the history of it. So he had quite and actually he still has a large collection of the books, mostly about the military aircraft, weapons, from all of the countries and all the sides. That's where I developed my interest for the mechanical side and more technical side of the World War II. And then when I was approximately 12 or 13 years old, my father started buying me kits to assemble of the scale 1/35 of plastic models from the soldiers and tanks, and just in general the weapons that were used in World War II. And I was creating them alongside with creating dioramas with the houses and etc. That's where I developed my interest, a really large interest for the World War II. And then I started reading in my own free time the books from different perspectives, from the Soviet Union side and from the Germany side. I really enjoyed the books about the German Luftwaffe pilots, which was very interesting, which was a recollection of the memories of the ace pilots like Erich Hartmann and the others. and also used to read some books about the U.S. armies in the D-Day operation and the operations on the Japanese occupied islands, which was also very interesting.
It's so wide ranging, isn't it? You can go in so many different directions. For me, it's the stories, the characters. For every patent, there's these unsung, heroes that sometimes you don't find out about until much later. I'm just going to share really quickly the story of Yang Wangjiang. So in June 44, he surrendered to American paratroopers. They assumed he was Japanese, but he was Korean. Now, think about this for a second. It's D-Day. American paratroopers are capturing a Korean. So, he got in with the Germans. But it's way more complicated than that. So in 1938, at the age of 18, he's forcibly conscripted by the Japanese into their Kwantung Army in Manchuria. Okay, this is 38. A year later, he's captured by the Red Army after their battle in Khalkhin Gol and sent to a labor camp. In 42, the Soviets needed soldiers, so drafted him into their forces. So he's gone from, hang on if I get this right, he's gone from conscripted into the Japanese army, now he's in the Red Army, and now he's fighting for the Red Army. So in early 43, he's taken prisoner by the German army at the Battle of Kharkov in Ukraine. So in 44, wearing a German uniform, he's sent to France to defend Utah Beach. He gets captured at D-Day, taken to a British prison camp, and then went on to live in the United States. Never spoke to anyone about this, even though he was at war for 6 years before he died in 1992 as an American citizen. So, that story speaks of the helplessness that the ordinary human being had to endure during these terrible times. He's just wrapped up in all these different giant armies, and he's just being pushed in one direction or the other. But how do you not get emotional about a war or an era when you hear about stories like that? It's just spectacular. So we could go into all the details about the figures, and everyone's aware how massive the war was, and whether it was 6 years or it was the First World War, went into the Second, went into the Cold War. But I think we're mostly interested into some of these bigger, larger-than-life characters that either, we've gone down that rabbit hole of researching about them, or we're just so inspired by what they did. So, Matthew, is it any one or two that stand out for you?
I mean, well, Churchill. I've chosen as my coursework for history. So I've got a recent 8,000 words essay on it that I have to bring down, but I have that on him. So Churchill is obviously the most. I mean, Hirohito is immensely interesting because of how he was strong-armed by his own military. Stalin was mental, and that's interesting. Likewise for Hitler, even more so. I mean, you hear about him and you hear all these comparisons, and it's like the guy was anti-smoking, anti-animal abuse,
vegetarian.
He was a vegetarian, and he had animals as pets and looked after them like we would today.
Blondie, the German Shepherd.
He banned smoking because he didn't think it was good for you in a time when everyone smoked and thought it was good for them. And it was, and then he did all these other things. I was like, this is two different people, but it's the same guy. It's so obviously it's not redeeming, but it's it brings a different perspective to him, and I find that really interesting.
Yes, for me personally, I think obviously for me the most interesting, the most influential people are Hitler and Stalin, just because of their huge personalities and the ideas and ideologies that they brought in the early 20th century, which is also very interesting, as long as alongside with their own background, how they came up to become what they become. With Hitler, who originally wanted to become a painter, and Stalin, who originally wanted to become a priest, which is quite crazy to think about. And yeah,
it's I think cult of personality is what they use to describe these different leaders, and that's just it. It was a cult of personality, isn't it? And that went on to Khrushchev and John F. Kennedy, and they're really, you say larger than life figures. They have these immense following, and to this day, I think after Russia, after the Soviet Union, the Soviets were pining for the good old days of Stalin. Like you forget, don't you? And grass is always greener. You look back, back in the day, it was way better than this. And you always refer to these characters. I'll throw Franklin Roosevelt in there, just because battled polio, but he insisted on doing his duty no matter what as president. And not that I'm model myself after a president, but I always really enjoyed how in the first 100 days, as part of the New Deal, this was before the New Deal, wasn't it? They were willing to try anything to improve the American economy. And to a small degree, with my job that I do here, is just try anything. Be flexible, be willing to try as many different things as you can to be successful. And if it doesn't work, well, you tried it, try something else. So it's more like a personal thing. I always think about Franklin Roosevelt. And he was only a major, but Major Richard Dick Winters. So shout out to all the Richards out there. But he was best known as commander of Easy Company, made famous in the in the drama Band of Brothers, which is also a book. So he was known as commander of Easy Company, part of the 101st Airborne. So he earned the rank of major. He had uncompromising values, always remained humble. He was a throwback to a different era, even in that era. And his grandson asked him after the war, he said, "Grandpa, were you a hero in the war?" To which Winters responded, "No, but I served in a company of heroes." So you gotta love men like Dick Winters. Right. So we spoke about our family and their history. We mentioned some of these stories. Is there any story in particular that, one specific thing that just stays with you? I mean, you guys have studied a lot of World War II. Is there that one that you kind of that you can tell amongst the other historians that you're with, and that they would be, oh yeah, that's pretty impressive. Andrei?
Well, to be fair, it's kind of hard to think, but yes, in general, because of so many people who fought for the USSR army, there are so many histories to think about. As for example, the partisan movement from the early 1940s, with a lot of small children helping the Red Army to fight against the Nazi occupants, and it's very hard to pick one specific story because of the amount of force and the time spent at the war. Just a very, very tough thing. And you can also think about the military leaders of the USSR Red Army, which also have a lot of interesting stories, like with the Marshal Zhukov or Marshal Konev. There are lots of different stories, which for me is quite difficult.
That Zhukov story is one of my top 5 favorites. When he gets summoned to go see, I don't know if he got summoned to see Stalin or Khrushchev, and he said goodbye to his wife, and he's like, "That's it, I'm done. They're going to kill me." And he gets there, and they say, "Yeah, we need you to go defend Stalingrad." And he's like, "Well, 50-50. They're either going to kill me right here, or I'm gonna get promoted, and save the war. Save Stalingrad in a way." Matthew, what about you?
My favourite character from World War II is a guy called Jack Churchill. Absolutely no relation to Winston Churchill, but they did help him out later. But I'll skip over the stuff, but he was in Dunkirk and stuff like that. But I'll skip over the first bit. So in Operation Husky, that's the Allied invasion of Sicily. He led 2 commando units from their landing site in Catania Bay in Sicily. He was wearing his kilt. He had a Scottish broadsword around his waist, a longbow with arrows, and his bagpipes. That's what he went to war with. It's like, this guy is nuts. This is 1943. He's going against machine guns. And he took 42 prisoners with 3 men. And this is because they used bagpipes, and it makes him sound like 100 men because of the big drones at the back. And from that, he would receive the Distinguished Service Order. He got captured in a later deployment to Yugoslavia, but they ransomed him to the UK and kept him safe in relatively good condition because of his last name. So they all thought he was related to Churchill. And then, following the VE Day, he requested that he went back and then he went to fight in Burma. But on his way, VJ Day was declared. And he was so disappointed that he went off and he carried on his career as an officer. But he was so disappointed in it that the war is already over before he got to fight any Japs. If it was, I've got the quote here. If it wasn't for those damn Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years.
That's excellent. You hear about those Japanese soldiers that are sent on random islands, and nobody told them it was over. They're fighting guerrilla style. I think somebody got pulled out in the 60s or 70s.
I was way later than that.
It wasn't even later. And they needed the commanding officer. He's like, I'm only coming out if my commanding officer comes and tells me. And they wheel out this retired army general.
Yeah, this guy, it's from Japan, so they're all over 100 years old.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? I have one that, there's Patton, because I can tell you, I had a lot of disciplinary American football coaches, as I grew up. And I think, no word of a lie, I had 3 different coaches show me the opening of the film Patton, telling you, we gotta win, we gotta go out there and win. It's just, George C. Scott with his famous role as Patton in the film. And I have had so many coaches embody George Patton in that, because some of his greatest achievements were getting the most out of his army and kind of being underdogs and scrappy. And then you have the other things like we talked about, slapping privates and come on, you gotta be tough. And he didn't believe in cowardice, didn't believe in shell shock, PTSD, anything. But hands down, the winner for me is Teddy Roosevelt Jr. So not the president, but the eldest son of the president. So he, lifelong soldier. Now, this is the son of a president, so he could settle for a very, pretty easy life. Instead, as a governor of Puerto Rico, he then returns to the U.S. and serves in North Africa. Has big falling out with Patton. Then D-Day is happening, and he demands to be a part of it. Now, he's denied. He's 56. They don't think he's going to make it. He gets approved, and the president actually approves him to go. And on Utah Beach, he actually makes it onto the craft. He is the highest ranking and oldest person in the invasion. So he's the only general on D-Day to land by sea in the first wave of troops. 56, he's the oldest man in the invasion. His son landed on Omaha Beach. So think about that. He was there, and his son landed on Omaha. He's famously, everyone's ducking down. You've all seen the Normandy landing and Saving Private Ryan. He's got his pistol, his handgun. He's shooting up there. He's like, "Come on, let's go!" And everyone's cowering for cover. Because they're getting shelled. He survives, makes it. His health starts deteriorating after that. He dies a week later in France. What a cowboy! Is somebody in a complete from a different time period, a different century, and he was here. Like he could have been in the Middle Ages with a giant axe in his hand, but instead there he was, making sure that he probably knew he was going to die. He just wanted to be a part of the D-Day landing, and he wasn't going to accept some sort of administrative role. But these are the kinds of things that we get passionate about. We've talked about a few different books, some shows, some films. Matthew, what do you recommend for our listeners?
There's Churchill's books. There's so many of them actually, but all Churchill's volumes on them. Obviously, they give a very British perspective on it. Obviously, the British did a lot of cruel things that would not be accepted in modern warfare. My favourite film is Hacksaw Ridge, and that's my favourite World War II film is Hacksaw Ridge, and that's Desmond Doss as Okinawa Beach. That's Andrei?
Yeah, for me personally, in Russia there was a really good line series of books called Behind the Line of Front, and I'm pretty sure the English name should be kind of similar because it's my loose translation from Russian, and it's basically the recollection of stories of German soldiers who fought in the World War II. Basically their memories recollected in autobiographical style, and I got to learn quite a lot of interesting things about how was the war at the other side of the line compared to the stories that we all as Russian people get to hear in school, and it's very interesting experience for me personally.
I've got two to recommend. One author is fantastic, Anthony Beevor. So he's done Fall of Berlin. He's done a book called Second World War, but his best work is Stalingrad. So I actually read it in university, and I've gone back to it a few times. The Battle of Stalingrad is one of the most depressing, harrowing, difficult things to read about. Trying to survive the German onslaught there in, I want to say, December to January 41, 42. Also, Atkinson's Guns at Last Light, that actual story that I told you about Uncle Tom, that was from that book. So you talk about someone who's done their research. It's all about the D-Day landings from 44 into 45, that book. I can't recommend enough the show Band of Brothers, which is 20-year anniversary is this year. Maybe that's an anniversary podcast in the waiting. But produced by Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, it is just absolutely phenomenal. The performances are great. He follows Easy Company, mentioned Dick Winters earlier. And some films for you. There's Saving Private Ryan, which I think when you think about the Normandy landings, you think about that movie. It's done such a great job of, like, that's how you picture it. It's just the perfect scene. I'd love to do that as a rewatchable film on the podcast. And two that aren't as well known, there's Downfall in 2004. So this is all about the final 2 weeks of the German high command. It takes place from Hitler's perspective in the bunkers, based on the letters that his private secretary wrote. So that's a great film. And the other one that I only found out about maybe 10 years ago is called Come and See, which is a 1985 Belarusian film about what Andrei was talking about, the resistance of these smaller Russian communities, these villages really, that were going, the Einsatzgruppen were the death squads of following the SS. So the SS would come in and win the battles against the armies, and then the Einsatzgruppen would come in and clear out all the civilians. And I can't think of a more depressing film. It's one of those you watch once and you think, you can't do it. But if you have an interest in this topic, I highly recommend it. And so that kind of leaves us with just the lasting legacy of VE Day. You heard kind of our perspective and our things. I think everyone has a story. Their families all have stories about this time period as we look at, the 76th anniversary. Speak to your family members. Find out from your relatives. What was it like? What was it like 76 years ago when the war ended? How was your family involved? We only have these stories. Your uncle and my father-in-law's great uncle, and your family. We can only keep these stories going if we have these conversations. So I urge everyone who listens, spread the word, share the pod, and have those conversations. We'll be back again. Keep the episodes flowing.
Next week with the Warden and Kez.
We got Warden Dr. Olison, we got Kez, we got Meredith. We're talking about Land Rovers next week. We might have a special Andrei episode. The Upper Six have less than 2 weeks of their studies.
12 days.
12 days, but who's counting? So in those 12 days, we might have 12 podcasts. Just everyone wants to do one now because they're going to leave soon. We can get in as many as we can.
We've simplified the setup so we can actually get it done. In theory, it's Audacity. Everything can be done.
We're going to do it. And then once these guys go, we can patch them in. We've got the younger guys and girls that they want to get involved. I know we have a farming pod that is in its infancy. So lots to look forward to. Lots of big anniversaries for some of the things we're most interested about. I know everyone's keen to get a Marvel episode in before the summer. There's so much to do and talk about. So that's the perfect time to sign off. Thank you to our guest, Andrei. Andrei, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it was a big pleasure for me to be on this podcast.
Andrei was the absolute last-minute addition, but he could not resist being a guest.
He actually joined after our scheduled start time.
And thank you for Matthew Nusa. It looks great, and as always, the pod's a burgeoning enterprise that spread the link around, everybody. But thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time on the RRR Reads Renegade Radio Pod. Signing out.